Hi everyone. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about a couple of CSS fun facts that I've collected over the years, the kind of things that were interesting to me when I finally did understand them, or took me a very long time to figure out. And it is my hope that some of these things are new to you, or at least that they are entertaining in some way. And I'm sure that at the end of the talk, you'll agree that CSS is much more powerful and even more beautiful than what we end up using it for in our day-to-day jobs. So first, let me just quickly introduce myself. Hi, I'm Mathias. I work for Opera Software in developer relations. And before that, I used to freelance as a web developer, a front-end web developer. So you could say I have been dealing with CSS for a lot of years. Now, I like web standards in general, programming, web security, and working on open source projects. Now, if you have any questions at all during this talk, like if you're watching the live stream or whatever, or watching this video later, just send me a message on Twitter. My handle is just my first name, Mathias, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Of course, if you're here today, just come talk to me afterwards, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Now, let's get started. Let's start off with everyone's favorite CSS feature, important. Yeah. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with what important does, right? In a situation like this, for example, all the elements with class bar get the green color, but all the elements with class bar within an element with class foo get a red color. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new here, and that looks something like this. So whenever there's a conflict between two selectors in CSS, then by default, the last one in the source code wins, but in this case, the specificity for both selectors is different. The one with the highest specificity wins, regardless of the order in the source code. So here, the specificity of the first selector with the two class selectors in it is actually higher than the specificity of the last one, and that's why the color is red and not green. Again, I'm sure this is nothing new to you. Now, in some situations, you may need to override an earlier rule set. So in this case, you want all elements with class bar to be green, despite of that other CSS rule at the top there. And it's cases like this where important can be useful. You can just add important to that last statement there, and it boosts that single declaration precedence in CSS. So if you do that, then the color, in fact, will become green. And again, I'm sure this is nothing new to you. You know how important works, right? Well, what once surprised me here is that important actually has nothing to do at all with specificity. It's actually a completely different thing. It boosts a single declaration's precedence without affecting the specificity for the whole selector. Now, you may have heard that the use of important is actually a bad practice, so you're not actually supposed to be using it, even though sometimes we all do. Now, the good news is, now that we know that there's a difference between specificity and the use of important, we can actually fake important. We can use important without using important. And instead of boosting the declaration's precedence, we can just increase the selector specificity. So all we have to do is just repeat the class name in the last selector a couple of hundred times. And every time you do that, you boost the selector specificity. So if you just do that enough times, automatically this selector will eventually win. And just to show you that this actually works, it does. And in this case, we only need to repeat the class name once. So if it's there twice, it will be the strongest one, the specificity will be highest, and it will win. So there you have it. I know it's still early in the morning, but already we've established our new best practice of the day. Yay. Not really. OK, so let's talk about font family names in CSS. Now, let's do a show of hands if you've heard this one before. If there's white space in the font family name, it must be quoted. No? No one has heard this before? OK. I got this off the W3C CSS validator. It used to give this message when you had some CSS like this one, font family Comic Sans MS, and you forgot the quotes around it. It would give you the warning, hey, you're supposed to be quoting this. So for a very long time, I was afraid of having white space in font family names without using quotes around it. But a couple of years later, I actually found out that this doesn't really make a lot of sense at all. Spaces are not problematic in font family names, usually. If the font family name is a space-separated set of CSS identifiers, there's no problem at all. So if you want to use Comic Sans MS, you don't actually need the quotes. The CSS will still be valid, and it will still work exactly the same way in all browsers. Now, there's a lot of exact rules and description and exceptions here. If you want, you can check out the URL in the middle of this slide for all the details. But trust me when I say that in this case, we can simply omit the quotes and everything will still work exactly the same way. In fact, there are other things that are much more dangerous than whitespace in font family names. Here's an example. Let's say we have a font named 456 Beria Street. Now, because this font family name starts with a digit, it's no longer a valid CSS identifier. So this rule won't actually silently be ignored. It's not valid CSS. Now, the way to fix that is to make it a valid identifier, and we can do that by escaping that first digit there. And that will look something like this. Now we get \3456 Beria Street. And that's kind of weird, right? Because the font family name is 456 Beria Street, but now it says 3456, and there's a space, and there's a backslash, and it's all just a little bit crazy. And this is probably not code that you want to be writing or maintaining. Now, how else can we resolve this problem? Well, of course, you guessed it. We can just use quotes around the font family name. So whenever you're in doubt, I would say just always use the quotes. It avoids a lot of problems, and that way you don't have to think about all these issues that might pop up. But the thing I learned here is that there is no need to use the quotes just because of white space. That's just not true. Now, I really wanted to understand how all this works, and so I ended up making a small tool for it. So you can enter any font family name in there, and it will tell you if it can be used without the quotes in CSS or not. Now, let's take a closer look at attribute values in HTML and CSS. As you probably know, in both HTML and CSS, we can use quotes around attribute values. I'm sure that's not big news for you. So here we have an anchor element with an href of foo, and then in the CSS style block, we select that same element based on its attribute value. And then we give it a nice hot pink background. Now, in some cases, like in this example, we can actually omit these quotes, and everything still works fine. The HTML is still valid, the CSS is still valid, and the result looks the same in every browser. There's no problems whatsoever. However, it's important to note that the rules for unquoted attribute values actually differ between HTML and CSS. In this example, the HTML is valid. The attribute value is foo pipe bar. But the CSS actually is invalid in this case, and it won't work. It will actually silently be ignored, and there will be no beautiful hot pink in this example at all. So how do we resolve this? Again, you guessed it. All you have to do is just use the quotes. And in this case, it's only really necessary to use quotes for the CSS version. But in general, the same advice holds. It's probably best to just always wrap your attribute values in quotes, both in HTML and in CSS, because that way you just don't have to think about all these potential issues and about the difference between HTML and CSS rules. I really wanted to understand this as well, and all these real differences between HTML and CSS. So I ended up making another tool. And you can enter any value. It will instantly tell you if it can be used as an unquoted attribute value in HTML and in CSS. And as you can see, in some cases, the result is actually different between these two languages. OK, another thing I learned something new about is CSS comment. As you probably know, this is the only comment syntax that CSS supports. It starts with a slash followed by an asterisk, and then it ends with an asterisk followed by another slash. And anything in between those two things will become part of a comment, even if it's like a new line character. So it can become a multi-line comment that way. Now, that's why this example works the way you expect it to. The color::red rule, it won't be affected. It will silently be ignored because it's part of a comment. Now, lots of other programming languages have another comment line syntax as well. This is the single line comment syntax. And it uses just 2 slashes, and everything else on the same line will be ignored in that case. However, CSS doesn't support this syntax. It doesn't have the concept of single line comments. So this is actually invalid CSS. However, what surprised me about this is that this specific example would actually work the way you would expect it to. The line with color::red will not have any effect. So what's going on there? Well, it turns out that property names in CSS are supposed to be valid CSS identifiers. And identifiers cannot contain unescaped slashes. And because of that, this one rule fails to parse, and CSS just skips it, moves on to the next one, and then applies that. Now, it would be different if the property name that we're using was a valid identifier, because then the CSS would be parsed just fine. However, CSS grammar also states that rules for unknown properties are silently ignored. So this gives us another way to fake a single-line comment in CSS. We could just use the British spelling, or we could just make some typos in the property name, and that's kind of crazy, and you should never deliberately do this probably, but it kind of works in the sense that the rule is silently ignored. Now, Tab Atkins has an excellent blog post that explains these tricks, and it's a good way to learn a little bit about CSS grammar and about how CSS error handling works. So check it out. Now, there's something else that's related to CSS that I would like to show you, but before I can do that, we need to talk about HTML tags for a little while. Now, does anyone know the difference between HTML tags and elements? Let's do a quick show of hands. Okay, not a lot of people are confident in the difference, so I'll just briefly explain it. Tags are the things that you type into your code editor when you're editing an HTML page. So for example, if you have a paragraph element on your page, you can have a start tag to open the paragraph element and an end tag to close that P element. Those are tags. But as soon as your document is parsed by the browser, it becomes a DOM, a document object model. It becomes this tree-based thing that you interact with in JavaScript or in CSS. And once that happens, we no longer think in terms of start and end tags. We think in terms of elements. So that's pretty much the difference. As soon as the page is open in the browser, it's elements and not tags that we're thinking about. And that's important to realize because if you're dealing with CSS or JavaScript, you're always interacting with these elements, not with tags or start tags or end tags. So anyway, here's an example. This is a very simple HTML document. So you see the HTML and the head and the body tags there. Well, it turns out that their closing tags, their end tags, are optional. You can just omit them. And the result is a compact but still valid HTML document that results in exactly the same DOM as the one before. But it gets even better. It turns out that you can also omit their start tags for these elements. And that way you end up with this very minimal but still valid HTML document that still results in exactly the same DOM. So that's really important here. The HTML, the head, and the body elements will still be there in the DOM, even though their tags are omitted from the source code. And that's because these elements are special. They're kind of implied, and the browser will automatically insert them into the document for you, even if they're not part of the source code. So with that in mind, this is probably the most useless tattoo ever. I mean, if you're going to get an HTML tattoo, at least you should pick some tags that aren't implied, right? Now, anyway, that minimal HTML document that I just showed you got me thinking. How far can we really take this? And what more can we remove from our HTML source code if we stop caring about what's valid and what isn't? And then I came across Martin Cole's experiment called No JavaScript. So he attempted to recreate a game using CSS only. And his goal was to use no JavaScript at all and as little HTML as possible. And in fact, this is the full HTML source code for his project. It's just one line that includes a style sheet onto the page. And really, you should check this out for yourself. The URL is right there. But just to give you a quick idea of what it looks like, well, here it is. So remember, this is all CSS. And I'm not sure if you can see this, but the spaceship at the bottom is actually following my mouse cursor, which sounds simple if you have JavaScript access. But if you want to do this using only CSS, it's actually very tricky. Now, the elements that are being styled here are the ones that we've talked about before, the ones that the browser automatically creates for you, even if they're not part of the source code. So HTML, head, and body. And then there's also that one link element that he had there in the source code. So, of course, the link and the head elements are invisible by default, but you can just apply display block to them to make them visible. Then you can start styling them, giving them a background image, and all that stuff. So anyway, we have HTML, head, link, and body. That's 4 different elements. Then we can also use the before and after pseudo elements on these elements, and that totals up to 12 unique stylable blocks. So what you're looking at here is just 12 unique stylable blocks, and that's enough to create this, apparently. It's kind of crazy, and this really blew my mind, this demo. So I created a demo of my own. It's not nearly as impressive as this one, but I still want to talk about it. This is what it looks like. Yeah, I know, right? It's not nearly as impressive to look at as the previous one, but it looks fairly simple. And if I were to see this on a random website, I would probably think it was just some basic HTML, like a paragraph element or something. and with some very basic CSS to style it. But in fact, if you look at the source code for this page, you'll see that it's completely empty. So what is going on here? Well, this is the trick that I used. I'm using the link HTTP header here. So in theory, this header can be used instead of the link element in HTML. Anything you can do with the link element in HTML can also be done with the link HTTP header in browsers that support it. And at the moment, only Firefox supports it. Opera used to support it before we switched to Blink, but ever since we've dropped support. So if you want to try this out, visit this page in Firefox. So anyway, this gives us a completely empty HTML document. As you can see, the content length is 0, so I'm not cheating there. I'm not using any special weird tricks. It's really an empty HTML document, but we still get a CSS file applied to it. So the next step is to make the document look like it contains some actual text. And for this, I use the CSS content property. So I select the body element, which the browser automatically creates for me, even though I don't have the tag for it in the source code. Then I target the after pseudo element, and then I just give that some content. And that's how I made the text show up there. So that is how this demo, without any HTML source code at all, works. Now, is this really useful? Well, I don't know. Maybe you can prank your colleagues with this knowledge a little bit. Or if you're really evil, you could use it as part of an interview question. Imagine this. So you give an interview candidate a URL and tell them to open it in Firefox. And this URL points to an HTML document that contains some inline SVG, for example. The SVG that displays a circle, as you can see here. Now, the circle's fill attribute is set to red. And that's when you ask the interview candidate, why is the circle green instead of red? And it will probably take them a very long time to realize that there's a hidden CSS file that magically gets applied to this document, even though you can't see it in the source code. I mean, the styles are not even visible if you inspect the element in the DevTools. So yeah, good luck with that. I hope none of that ever happens to you in an interview. OK, if we want to talk about Unicode in CSS, we need to talk about Unicode in HTML too. So let's start there. The first thing you should know is that the class attribute accepts every possible character. Every possible Unicode character is valid in a class attribute value. And it will also work in every browser. So for example, 404-error is a valid class name, which is probably not very surprising to you. But you could also use the copyright sign as a class name for an element containing a legal disclaimer, for example. Now, in HTML5, in the standard, there is this new feature that says that the same thing now finally goes for the ID attribute. So this is new in the spec, but browsers have always supported this. This means that IDs can contain any symbol at all, except for white space. But everything else is valid as part of an ID attribute. So you could use the heart symbol as the ID for a paragraph, for example. Or you could use curly quotes as a class name for a block quote element. You can do all kinds of stuff. You can even use hidden emoji to passive-aggressively tell people they're using a shitty browser. And all of this is valid HTML. This also means that we can do stuff like this, where you give an element an ID of #ID, or let's say a class of .class. Or you could even combine the two and add hover braces at the end, or even use a value that resembles an attribute selector. You see where this is going, right? All these classes and IDs already look like they're a CSS selector. So how would you write a CSS selector to select these elements based on these IDs and classes? Well, the answer is we need to escape these values first so that they become valid identifiers. And only then we can use them as part of a CSS selector. And this is what that will look like. The hash symbol, for example, has special meaning in CSS, so it cannot be used as it is. We must escape it as \hash first. And the same thing goes for the dot character. It has special meaning, so that becomes \dot. The colon character needs escaping too, and theoretically you could escape that as \:, but that doesn't work in old versions of Internet Explorer, so a more compatible way to escape it is to use \3a followed by a space. And 3a is the Unicode code point that refers to this character. So you could use this type of escape for any Unicode symbol if you want to. Anyway, as you can see, many characters need escaping. But take a look at that last example. The element with ID 404-error, because that ID starts with a digit, it needs to be escaped as well. And I remember that this really surprised me at some point because I was trying to figure out why it was impossible to style such an element using CSS. Well, it turned out I just had to escape it. And that looks like \34 space 04 dash error, which is kind of weird if you think about it. So if you'd ever need to style an element whose class or ID starts with a digit, I'm sure you will think back on this moment, because it took me a long time to figure this out. Now, as for the other examples with the non-ASCII Unicode symbols, well, those can just be used without escaping them at all, because they don't have any special meaning in CSS. Now, you could still escape them if you wanted to, based on their Unicode code point value, and that would look like this. Now, to help me understand all this, I built another one of those tools. So it allows you to enter any ID or class name, even the crazy ones, and then it will automatically tell you how to select that element in CSS or using the selectors API in JavaScript. So if you're using document.querySelector or jQuery or something like that, it will tell you what the selector would look like after the double escaping that you need for that. Nowadays, there's a standardized utility method for this in the form of a JavaScript API called css.escape. And this is part of the CSS object model specification. It's already supported in Opera, Chrome, and Firefox, so you can actually already start using this today. If you need support for older browsers as well, there's a polyfill available that you can use. Now, the thing is, you probably need this functionality much more often than you would think. And here's some examples of that. I'm sure many of you have done something like this at some point. I know I have. So you read the hash from the URL, and then you use it to select an element in JavaScript. This is fairly common if you use a tabs widget on your page, for example. So look at this code and imagine what happens if the location hash contains a space, for example. Now, the entire meaning of the selector that we dynamically generate would suddenly change, because instead of selecting an element based on that ID, it would now become a descendant selector. Now, here's another example where we dynamically construct a CSS selector. What if some value, in this case, contains double quotes? The CSS selector would actually be broken because the attribute selector would be closed by the double quote. This might throw a JavaScript error and otherwise break your site. So this code is actually broken, but it's not really obvious to see that. Now, how can we avoid these problems? Well, all we need to do is just wrap the variable parts of these selectors in a call to css.escape. And that magically makes it work and protects against these cases. Now that we're on the subject of breaking things using malformed CSS selectors, let's take a look at how CSS can be used for evil. Now, first we need to talk about cross-site scripting, or XSS. Has anyone ever heard of that before? Okay, yeah, some people, some evil hackers in the room. Now, even if you have heard of cross-site scripting, I would recommend checking out Google's cross-site scripting game. It's a really great way to learn about how these cross-site scripting attacks work and how you can exploit them yourself. And actually, if you give this a try, you would be surprised how simple it is to perform these attacks yourself. Now, most websites nowadays contain they display user-supplied content in different contexts within an HTML document. So here, a custom user caller is inserted in the context of a CSS value. Then the username is inserted in an HTML text context as part of a paragraph element. The user profile URL is injected in a quoted HTML attribute value. The user ID is inserted in a JavaScript context on the right-hand side of a variable declaration. And finally, some server-generated debug information is inserted as part of a comment in HTML. So all of these things are variable content which can somehow be controlled or at least influenced by the user. And the website that displays this information in the HTML code needs to make sure that the user input is properly sanitized and escaped for the context that it gets inserted to. And that is the main problem. Each of these 5 different contexts requires its own different escaping rules. So usually, web application hackers look for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities which enable them to execute custom JavaScript code in the context of the targeted website. Once they found such a vulnerability, they can basically do anything they want in JavaScript to that website. So the hacker could add a script that listens for keyboard events, for example, and then logs whatever it logs your keystrokes, that the victim enters to their own server, for example. It would essentially be a keylogger. Or it could just read sensitive information from the DOM and then leak it to the attacker's server so that they basically steal that data. Now that's using JavaScript, but this is a CSS conference, so let's shift our perspective here. What can we do if we have full control over a page's CSS, but nothing else? What's the worst thing we can do as an evil hacker in that case? In other words, what if all these injections that we talked about are all sanitized properly, except for the first one, this one? So for the sake of the example, assume that there is some sort of sanitation going on there that makes it impossible to close the style element in the HTML, but everything else is allowed. So you can inject any CSS you want, but you cannot inject arbitrary HTML. What damage can you do with that? Well, does anyone remember the CSS Zen Garden? Yeah, some people. If you look this up, you'll end up at this website. It's just a very simple HTML document, and it can be styled using CSS. And anyone is free to contribute a CSS file with a custom design, and if it looks good, it will be added to the site. So here's a bunch of different designs. There's over 200 on this website already, and they all look beautiful and completely different. And the main thing here is that the only thing that is really changing between these designs is the CSS. The HTML is exactly the same for every page that you see here. So this is a very powerful demonstration of what CSS can do. Now, if you look at this from the perspective of an evil hacker, imagine having that kind of power over a website that you're targeting. The obvious thing to do as an evil hacker is, of course, to completely deface the website. You can make it look like whatever you want, basically. So here's the original CSSConf website, for example. Now, if you had full control over the CSS, but nothing else, you could make it look like this. And I'm not sure they would sell any tickets this way because it's a CSS conference and you have some certain expectations about their use of CSS. So when an attacker is able to control the CSS of your page in such a way, that's probably not what you want. It could be even worse. I mean, they could just hide all the existing content and then just apply a background image that contains some text of their own, for example. So they could basically replace all the existing content of the site with whatever they want. There's something else that you could do, and this is kind of similar to defacing, but it's much more subtle. You wouldn't touch the design, but you would just inject some really annoying CSS rules. And there's a project that collects CSS rules like that. It's called evil.css. And it's just a CSS file, basically, with a bunch of really annoying CSS rules. It also contains some rules that are just super bad for performance, just for the fun of it. And yeah, again, here's the original CSS DevFest website. And here's that same website with evil.css enabled. So there's now extra scroll bars everywhere. The layout is slightly broken. Some of the content is flickering or missing. The text is slightly blurry. I'm not sure how easy to see that is. Yeah, there's a lot of content just missing suddenly. Scrolling also feels really, really slow because of all those terrible performance-wise CSS that is added to the page. And my favorite part is the first letter in each element is slightly smaller than all the other ones. It's so annoying. Anyway, so both defacing and doing this sort of thing to a website can be annoying for both the administrators and the visitors of the website. But it could be much worse, right? Because if we look back at cross-site scripting, well, you could steal sensitive information that way. And this is not possible using just CSS, right? Or is it? Well, let's see. CSS kind of allows you to leak the value for any attribute value in the DOM. So some attribute values contain security-sensitive information, like a CSRF token, for example. Now, if you were an attacker or a hacker, you wanted to steal this value attribute here using nothing but CSS injection, how would you go about it? Well, one way to do it is to write a bunch of CSS like this. You could use the CSS attribute starts with selector. And that way, it's trivial to figure out the first character of the CSRF token just by brute forcing it. You just try every possible value for that first character, and you include a unique background image URL on your own server for each character. And when the browser makes the request to your server, you know that that character matches. And then you can start doing the same thing for the first 2 characters, so to guess the second character, and so on until you have brute forced the entire token. So in the worst case scenario, you could just enumerate all the possible values for the CSRF token, but in practice, you don't really need to test all of them. It's a bit faster than that. And here's an actual proof of concept for this sort of attack. It doesn't use any JavaScript at all, so only a lot of CSS rules. And it's not very efficient or fast, but it shows that it is possible to actually exfiltrate sensitive data this way by using nothing but CSS. Now, that was about stealing information that was hidden in an HTML attribute. What if you want to steal data from the DOM that is part of a text node using nothing but CSS? So let's say we have some HTML like this that contains, let's say, a username or something else that we want to find out, or maybe it's the balance of your bank account, something like that. But you can't use JavaScript, you can only use CSS injection. How can we do this? Well, you could use Unicode range to define web fonts to be used only for specific characters. So if you create a separate font face declaration for each individual character with a unique URL for each font, you can essentially figure out which characters are being used as part of the CSS content. And here's a proof of concept of that. The demo was made by a guy named Masato Kinugawa. And as you can see, the browser makes a request for each of the characters that is being used as part of this sensitive content. Now, one downside is that it wouldn't show you the repeated characters. Like, for example, the letter A is being used 3 times in this case. And of course, the browser will only make 1 request for the font that is used for the letter A. But in many cases, it really depends on the use case, of course, but in many cases, just knowing which characters are being used is enough to guess the rest. Now, still, it could be worse. There could be an easy way to steal sensitive data that is fast, that is efficient, that doesn't require us to write lots of CSS. And it turns out there is such a thing as well in CSS. IE5 introduced this proprietary feature called CSS Expressions to make it possible to dynamically calculate the values for certain CSS properties. And this feature was supported up until IE7. Now, even if you've never seen this before, if you just look at the syntax closely, you'll note that the code wrapped in the expression part is actually JavaScript. So yeah, CSS expressions are basically a way to run JavaScript in your CSS. It's a great idea. I'm not sure what could possibly go wrong here. Anyway, because it's all just JavaScript, it means you can use browser-specific JavaScript methods as well, like alert, for example. This example would show an alert message, and that looks something like this. But it also means you can use DOM-related methods, like window.open. So you could actually open a new window with the URL of our choice using nothing but CSS. And that, of course, could be the URL for a malicious website, like a phishing website, that pretends to be the original website and then asks you for your password. And as soon as you enter it, of course, the attacker has stolen your password. Now, you may be thinking, OK, this really sucks. But if this only affects IE7 and older versions of IE, then what's the big deal? No one really supports those browsers anymore, and not a lot of people use IE7. Well, that's true, but the thing is, Internet Explorer has this thing called browser modes, and the last 4 major IE releases each shipped multiple rendering engines that emulated the bugs in their older IE versions. Their F12 developer tools allow you to easily switch between them. Now, that's all good, but it's also possible to trigger a specific rendering mode for your website by using an HTTP header or an HTML meta element. The meta tag on this slide ensures that your document is rendered in the latest available rendering mode. So this means that if someone using IE11 visits your site, it will render it using the IE11 rendering mode, which as a developer is probably what you want. In IE10, it will use IE10 mode. In IE9, it will use IE9 mode. That makes sense. However, this meta tag would trigger IE7 mode, even in IE8 or IE9 or IE10. And the thing is, this mode not only emulates the known bugs that IE7 used to have, but it also brings back the old deprecated or even removed features that IE7 used to have, such as CSS expressions. So our initial example that only worked in IE7 and older versions can be made to work even in IE8, 9, and 10 just by adding a meta tag. It even works in IE11 if the site is in the so-called trusted zone. So that's why I include IE11 in the title here, because it's a little bit trickier. So okay, that's pretty cool, but in our attack scenario from before, we could only inject CSS, and we couldn't inject HTML, so we had no way to add the meta tag there. So how can we still make use of this trick? Well, it turns out that the attacker can just create a web page of their own, hosted on their own server, add the meta tag there, and trigger IE7 compatibility mode. And then they could embed the targeted website with their CSS payload inside of an iframe. In that case, the document mode of the parent document is inherited by the targeted website in the iframe, even if the targeted website would normally use the latest available rendering mode. So this allows the attacker to use CSS expressions in the context of the target website, even in IE10. So just to recap, there's two conditions here. If a target website allows you to inject arbitrary CSS, and it allows framing, then this enables attackers to perform cross-site scripting attacks on your site in Internet Explorer using nothing but CSS. I thought that was kind of crazy. Now, what can you do about this? How can we avoid these CSS expression vulnerabilities as a website administrator? Well, of course, all of this can be avoided if you just sanitize all your untrusted input before injecting it into your HTML responses. All you have to do is never make a single mistake, and everything will be fine. Sure, like that's ever going to happen. So failing that, you could use the xframe options HTTP header to prohibit framing of your web page. And this makes it impossible for an attacker to easily kick your page into IE7 compatibility mode and thereby enable CSS expressions. And last but not least, and this is another thing that really surprised me, you could use the so-called HTML5 doc type, the short one. And it turns out that Internet Explorer uses this doc type as a heuristic. Whenever a page is rendered using this doc type, it will automatically disable CSS expressions. Even if your page gets framed and inherits the IE7 document mode, CSS expressions won't work with this doc type. And this is not true for any other doc type. So if you have a lot of old HTML pages on your server lying around that you don't even maintain anymore, it's definitely a good idea to just do a simple search replace on them and just update their doc type to use this one. It won't break anything and will actually make your site more secure in Internet Explorer. So to me, this is really kind of crazy to think about, because you need to add an HTTP header and use a specific doc type in your HTML just to prevent people from running JavaScript in your CSS. Well, it's a bit too much for me, really, but that's Internet Explorer, I guess. Now, it's not just IE. There's other browsers that used to have bugs with JavaScript and CSS. You can kind of execute JavaScript using nothing but CSS in other browsers, like old versions of Firefox used to have a bug. If you assign a background image to an element and point it to a JavaScript URL, the script would be executed. However, it would be executed in a sandbox, so it was not possible to actually steal any data from the DOM or do anything really malicious. But what you could do is, for example, trigger an infinite loop, and that would essentially hang Firefox. So if someone was able to inject this CSS into your page, someone would try to visit the site in Firefox, they would basically just get this. Yeah, well, it would look like this, and then it would just crash. Now, Mozilla has since fixed the bug, so this is not a problem anymore, but it really makes you think about how powerful CSS is. OK, and because I know it's still early, and I've just been talking about a lot of random different things, let's do a quick CSS quiz. Who's up for that? Yeah, hell yeah, that's the spirit. OK, so what band is this? I hope you like music. You can just shout if you want to guess. Could be. Yeah, that's the one, the Black Keys. Yeah, these guys. OK, next one. What band is this? You can just shout your guesses. It's fine to guess. What color is that? Foo Fighters. Oh, that would be good. No, it's not that. It's actually simply red. Yeah, it's just red. That was a terrible one. OK, let's try another one. What band is this? This requires some knowledge of the Unicode standard. Yeah, it's Radiohead. OK, one more. What band is this? I think someone said it already. Yeah, the White Stripes. All right. OK, now let's try a song, a famous pop song. What song is this? Yep, Painted Black by the Rolling Stones. Like, if you have a red door in CSS, you want to paint it black, you can use CSS blend modes for that, turns out. OK, what band is this? Yep, Green Day. Wow, that was quick. Respect. OK, let's try some more. Editors, yeah. That one might have been a little bit too geeky. OK, one last one before I go. What band is this? Yep, it's the Black Eyed Peas. There they are. OK. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and thanks to everyone whose research I've been using.